Imagine standing in the center of a massive stone amphitheater. Thousands of critical eyes are locked on you. Your entire future, your family name, and your survival depend on the very next words you speak. But when you open your mouth, your throat tightens, your voice trembles, the words stumble and break. And slowly, the massive crowd begins to laugh. This is not just a common nightmare. It is a historical reality. And it is the exact starting point of a story about how to build the most unshakable self-trust in human history. Welcome to ancient Athens in the year 384 BC. We are stepping into a vibrant, chaotic city. Imagine the Athenian agora, a sprawling civic center filled with the sharp smell of olive oil, the clatter of bronze coins, and the intense overlapping voices of merchants and politicians. In this ancient democracy, words were absolute power. There were no professional lawyers to hire for your defense. If someone wronged you, you had to stand up in front of a jury of hundreds of citizens and argue your own case. Your voice was your only shield. In this high-stakes environment, a young boy named Demosthenes was born into comfortable privilege. His father was an affluent swordmaker, running a highly successful manufacturing business. But historical records tell us that tragedy struck early. When Demosthenes was just 7 years old, his father passed away. Listen for this word: inheritance. An inheritance is the money, property, or title left to you when a family member dies. You can use it in a short phrase like this: he received a large inheritance. Try saying that quietly to yourself. He received a large inheritance. Demosthenes was left a massive inheritance, enough to secure his education and his future. To protect this wealth until the boy grew up, his father's will appointed 3 trusted friends as guardians: Aphabus, Demophon, and Theripides. But these men were not protectors. Over the next 10 years, they secretly betrayed that trust. They quietly drained the boy's accounts. Listen for this word: squander. To squander means to foolishly and carelessly waste something valuable, especially money or an opportunity. His guardians squandered his wealth on themselves. They sold his property, neglected his father's business, and left the young student with almost nothing. As Demosthenes grew into a teenager, he began to realize what was happening. He knew the logical next step. He knew he had to take these men to court and demand his stolen future back. But there was a terrible problem. Demosthenes was physically weak. He was frequently sick. And worst of all, for a young man living in a society obsessed with perfect public speaking, he had a severe speech impediment. He stuttered heavily, and he could not correctly pronounce the letter R. When he tried to speak, the other boys in the city mocked him. They gave him a cruel nickname: Battleless, a slang term meaning the weakling or the stutterer. We often like to believe that facing a great injustice automatically gives people steady courage. We watch movies where the hero is wronged and they immediately rise up to fight. But human psychology is much more complex, and reality is often much quieter. When we feel deeply inadequate, we rarely fight. Instead, we freeze. Listen for this word: procrastination. In modern English, procrastination means delaying an important task you know you must do. usually because you feel anxious, afraid, or overwhelmed by it. For years, young Demosthenes fell victim to severe procrastination. He watched his guardians steal from him, and he did nothing. He was trapped in a painful cycle of self-doubt. Because he did not trust his own voice, he avoided the problem entirely. This is the biology of doubt. When our brain perceives a social threat, like the threat of public humiliation, it triggers a powerful stress response. Our nervous system tells us to hide, to blend in, to stay safe. Demosthenes was hiding in plain sight, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. But hiding does not stop a thief. The money continued to vanish. A hard deadline was quickly approaching. When he turned 18 years old, the legal period of guardianship would end. He would have to face the public courts or lose his rightful property forever. Historians debate the exact turning point when Demosthenes finally decided to break his silence. One well-known account claims that his tutors secretly took him to attend a major public trial. There, standing quietly in the back of the crowd, the young student watched a famous speaker completely captivate the audience. He saw the sheer, undeniable power of words. He realized that a single person, armed with nothing but a well-trained voice and deep conviction, could alter reality. He decided right then that he would become a student of rhetoric, the ancient art of persuasion and public speaking. He began to study the complex laws of Athens. He started drafting his legal arguments. He began to learn the quiet power of discipline. Notice this important word, discipline. In historical English, discipline does not mean punishment. It means the steady, focused ability to train your own mind and character, doing what is necessary even when you are afraid. Demosthenes found a harsh but brilliant teacher named Isias, a man known for his aggressive legal strategies. The young student pored over ancient documents. He arranged his evidence. He built his case on paper. But reading words alone in a quiet room is very different from speaking them under the crushing pressure of a hostile crowd. To win back his life, Demosthenes would have to conquer his deepest physical insecurities. He would have to stand in the blinding Mediterranean sun, look his corrupt guardians in the eye, and command the attention of the city. If he failed, he would be left in permanent poverty, forever known as the boy who could not defend his own name. We have now reached the end of the first chapter of his life. A sickly boy, robbed of his wealth, has finally decided to step out of the shadows. He has stopped procrastinating. He is ready to demand justice. But what happens when you finally gather the strength to face your fears, and the world simply laughs in your face anyway? Why do some people let a devastating public failure destroy them, while others use that exact same failure to build an unbreakable foundation of self-trust? It is one thing to practice your courage in the absolute safety of an empty room. It is a completely different challenge to test that courage under the crushing weight of public judgment. The day arrived. Demosthenes stepped up to the bema, the raised stone platform where speakers stood in ancient Athens. Before him sat a sea of seasoned citizens. In the background, the steady drip of the clepsydra, the ancient water clock used to time public speeches, began to echo. His time was ticking. He had prepared his legal arguments flawlessly on paper, but now he had to deliver them aloud. He opened his mouth, but his lungs betrayed him. His breathing was terribly short. breaking his long, elegant sentences into confusing fragments. His voice was painfully weak, lacking the deep resonance needed to carry across the open air, and the severe stutter returned. Listen for this word, humiliation. It means a strong feeling of shame or embarrassment when you lose respect in front of other people. You can use it in a short phrase like this: he faced public humiliation. Try saying it to yourself. He faced public humiliation. The crowd of Athenians did not show mercy. In a society that worshipped perfect athletic bodies and brilliant persuasive voices, weakness was rarely tolerated. The citizens grew restless. They began to interrupt him. Notice this verb, to jeer. To jeer means to shout insulting words at someone loudly and aggressively, usually to mock them. Try saying it softly. The crowd began to jeer. The crowd laughed. They shouted over his weak voice, complaining about his tangled arguments and his terrible delivery. The noise swelled into a deafening roar. Overwhelmed and defeated, Demosthenes wrapped his heavy wool cloak around his face to hide his tears, and fled the platform. This is where we must pause to look at the biology of failure. When we experience severe social rejection, our brain's amygdala fires an intense alarm. A massive wave of cortisol, the primary stress hormone, floods our bloodstream. Physically, our body reacts to public embarrassment exactly the same way it reacts to a physical attack. The biological instinct is simple: run away, hide, and never expose yourself to that danger again. Many people let this biological response transform into a permanent psychological trap. They fail at a task, and they internalize the pain. Listen closely to how we use this word, shame. Shame is the toxic internal belief that because you failed, you are fundamentally flawed. Shame whispers that you are permanently broken. But overcoming doubt requires a completely different mindset. It requires handling failure without shame. It means learning to view your failure objectively, as a lack of mechanical skill rather than a lack of human worth. As Demosthenes wandered the streets of the port city, deeply depressed, historical sources, like the biographer Plutarch, tell us that an older, experienced man found him. Some accounts say it was a friend. Others suggest it was a famous actor named Satyrus. The older man listened to the young student complain that the citizens of Athens were cruel, that they ignored his brilliant legal arguments just because his voice was weak. The actor then asked Demosthenes to recite a few lines of classic poetry. Demosthenes did so, speaking the words plainly and flatly. Then, the actor repeated the exact same lines, but he used sweeping gestures, varied the tone of his voice, and brought the poetry to life with intense emotion. In that brilliant flash of contrast, Demosthenes understood his true problem. His failure was not a permanent curse. It was just a lack of training. His arguments were brilliant, but his delivery was physically untrained. He realized he did not need to be ashamed of his stutter or his weak breath. He simply needed to treat them as mechanical problems that required mechanical solutions. This realization is the foundation of building self-trust. When you remove shame from failure, you can look at your weaknesses clearly. You stop trying to protect your ego, and you start trying to solve the problem. But how does a person completely rebuild their physical voice and their self-trust after such a devastating public rejection? You cannot simply wish to be brave. Confidence is not magic. It is the result of keeping promises to yourself. Listen to this phrase: tiny promises. A tiny promise is a very small, manageable commitment you make to yourself and refuse to break. Try repeating this phrase: I will make tiny promises. Demosthenes knew that returning to the public assembly immediately would only lead to another disaster. He needed a safe environment where he could make and keep tiny promises every single day. He needed to track his progress without the cruel judgment of the crowd. He needed to establish intense, absolute boundaries between himself and the distractions of the outside world. So, he made a radical decision. He decided to completely remove himself from society. He began to build a strange, secret room entirely underground. We have closed the chapter on his darkest moment. Demosthenes has faced his worst nightmare. He has been laughed off the stage. Yet, instead of surrendering to shame, he has analyzed his failure like a scientist. But what exactly is he going to do in that dark, underground room? How will a young man with a stutter transform his weak breath into the most powerful voice in ancient history? And why do historical accounts say he deliberately shaved exactly one half of his head before he went down into the dark? Imagine choosing to bury yourself alive just to hear your own voice clearly. While the rest of Athens was soaking in the bright Mediterranean sun, arguing in the crowded marketplace, and enjoying the open-air theater, young Demosthenes was descending into the dark. He had built a subterranean study, a literal underground room. Historical accounts, such as those passed down by the ancient biographer Plutarch, describe this as his ultimate training ground. But before he went down into this quiet space to work, he did something shocking. He took a sharp blade and completely shaved exactly one half of his head, leaving the other half with long, thick hair. Why would a young man deliberately make himself look so strange and ridiculous? Listen for this core word: boundary. A boundary is a line that marks a limit. In psychology, creating a boundary means setting strict, non-negotiable rules to protect your time, your energy, or your focus. Try saying this short, powerful phrase aloud. Protect your boundaries. Demosthenes knew his own mind. He knew that the loud, exciting streets of Athens would constantly tempt him to leave his work. He knew the biological urge to seek comfort and socialize would overpower his desire to study. By shaving half his head, he created an extreme physical boundary. He was so deeply ashamed of his bizarre, unbalanced appearance that he physically could not leave the underground room for months at a time. He intentionally removed the option to quit. This was not an act of madness. It was an act of profound self-awareness. He was guarding his attention against the outside world. Listen to this word: distraction. A distraction is anything that pulls your attention away from what you are trying to do. In the modern world, our distractions are digital. A ringing phone, a bright screen, an endless feed of information. In ancient Athens, the distraction was the intense, fast-paced social life of the city above. By stepping into the dark room, Demosthenes separated his internal biology from the chaotic external society. Neuroscience tells us that when we remove constant external stimuli, our brains enter a state of deep focus. This quiet isolation allowed his nervous system to finally calm down. It stopped the painful flood of stress hormones that caused him to freeze in public. Down in the quiet earth, there was no massive crowd to judge him. There was no one to laugh at his mistakes. Here he could finally begin the slow, unglamorous work of building true courage. Notice this essential word, courage. Courage does not mean a lack of fear. It means the mental and moral strength to face difficulty and push through it, even when you are terrified. Try repeating this sentence gently. Courage is moving forward despite fear. But how do you actually build this courage? You do it through setting and keeping tiny promises. Demosthenes did not try to magically cure his severe stutter in a single day. He broke his massive, overwhelming problem into small, measurable, daily tasks. He created a system of absolute discipline. He began to track his progress. Listen to this phrase, track your progress. Tracking progress means carefully recording the small, daily improvements you make over time, rather than only looking at the final result. When you track your progress, you stop worrying about the distant, terrifying goal. You focus entirely on the very next step. Biologically, tracking progress is incredibly powerful. Every time you complete a tiny promise, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine. This chemical not only makes you feel good, but it also physically strengthens the neural pathways associated with that specific habit. By practicing in secret, Demosthenes was literally rewiring his brain. He was slowly replacing the neural pathways of fear and shame with new pathways of control and competence. Historians debate the exact methods he used in that room, but the legend of his intense dedication is universal. He practiced reading aloud, day after day. He worked on his posture. He studied the complex rhythms of historical texts, copying the brilliant historian Thucydides by hand over and over again to deeply understand the flow of powerful language. He watched his breath in the quiet, dusty air. Every single day that he stayed in that room, he kept a promise to himself. And every kept promise slowly rebuilt his fractured self-trust. He was proving to his own mind that he could rely on his own willpower. This is the secret architecture of confidence. You do not build self-trust by succeeding perfectly in public. You build it by keeping your word to yourself in private. When you say you will study for 1 hour, and you actually do it, your brain registers a victory. You prove to your own nervous system that you are reliable. We have seen how Demosthenes built a fortress against distraction. He secured his mind in the quiet of the underground room. He used an extreme boundary to force his own focus, replacing his public humiliation with private discipline. But focusing the mind is only half the battle. His physical weaknesses, the severe stutter, the incredibly short breath, the quiet voice, were still very real. A quiet room cannot fix a broken biological instrument. He needed to physically transform his body. So, what strange and painful physical exercises did this young man invent to force his vocal cords to obey him? How did he learn to project his voice louder than a roaring ocean? Imagine trying to shout a beautiful, complex poem while your mouth is full of heavy, smooth stones. It sounds like a strange punishment, but for Demosthenes, it was a daily, voluntary trial. Let us leave the dark, underground room and step out onto the windy coastline of ancient Greece. The Aegean Sea is not a quiet body of water. The waves crash violently against the rocky shores, creating a massive, roaring wall of sound. This wild, unforgiving environment is exactly where the young student took his physical training. He knew that fixing his mind in the dark was not enough. He had to physically rebuild his body in the light. Historical details from ancient biographers claim that Demosthenes developed a series of extreme physical exercises to cure his speech impediment. First, he walked along the beach and gathered small, smooth pebbles. Listen for this word, articulate. To articulate means to pronounce words clearly and distinctly, carefully shaping every single sound. Try saying this short phrase quietly to yourself. I will articulate my words clearly. Demosthenes placed the smooth pebbles under his tongue and forced himself to articulate complex legal arguments. Imagine the physical sensation. The heavy, cold stones rested on his tongue, getting in the way of his teeth and lips. The stones forced his facial muscles to work much harder to form the correct shapes. It was like lifting heavy weights, but for his jaw. When he finally took the stones out, speaking normally felt miraculously effortless. His stutter began to fade. But perfectly clear words are useless if no one can hear them. To fix his weak, trembling voice, he stood on the sand and shouted his speeches directly into the roaring ocean. Why the ocean? The deafening sound of the crashing waves perfectly mimicked the chaotic, aggressive noise of the Athenian assembly. It was a biological and social mirror. If he could project his voice loud enough to hear himself over the violent sea, he knew he could survive the shouting crowd in the city. Finally, to cure his severe shortness of breath, he ran up steep, rocky hills. As he sprinted upward, he forced himself to recite long, complicated verses of poetry without stopping. He felt the burning pain in his chest, forcing his diaphragm to push air out in perfectly measured sentences. Notice this important word, endurance. Endurance is the biological and mental ability to keep doing something difficult, painful, or stressful for a long time. Try repeating this short sentence. You must build your endurance. By subjecting his body to extreme physical exhaustion on the hills, he was expanding his lung capacity. But more importantly, he was expanding his psychological tolerance for discomfort. This is the profound connection between our biology and our society. Demosthenes realized that a weak physical instrument, his lungs and vocal cords, would always buckle under the intense social pressure of Athens. To survive the city, he had to conquer his biology. During these brutal exercises on the beach, he stumbled constantly. He dropped the pebbles. He lost his breath. He choked on his words. Every time this happened, he was technically failing. But this failure happened in total isolation. He was learning exactly how to handle failure without shame. When a pebble fell from his mouth, he did not cry or call himself a failure. He simply collected the data. A dropped stone meant he needed to adjust his jaw. A loss of breath meant he needed to engage his diaphragm. He removed the toxic emotion of shame and replaced it with cold, objective observation. Listen closely to how we use this word, overwhelm. To overwhelm means to give someone too much of a thing to handle, causing them to feel completely defeated. The loud noise of the crowd had previously overwhelmed him. But by voluntarily shouting over the ocean every single morning, in carefully controlled doses. In modern psychology, this is called exposure therapy. You do not avoid the thing that terrifies you until it no longer controls your nervous system. This was his system of tiny promises made physical. Every single morning, he woke up and promised himself he would face the ocean. He promised he would run the hill. When you keep these tiny physical promises, you begin to trust your own body again. And when you trust your body, you begin to trust your mind. Historians carefully debate the literal truth of every single pebble or every single steep hill, as ancient writers loved to dramatize their heroes. However, the core historical reality remains undeniable. Demosthenes applied relentless, systematic pressure to his own weaknesses. He did not ask for pity. He demanded absolute progress from himself. We have now witnessed a profound physical transformation. The weak, stuttering boy who ran away from the assembly has hardened his voice against the ocean. He has expanded his lungs on the hills. He has trained his tongue with stones. He is finally biologically prepared to speak clearly. But a strong voice is only a physical tool. A loudspeaker with no mental strategy will still lose a legal war. To actually defeat his corrupt guardians in a real court of law, Demosthenes needed more. He needed to anticipate their cruel attacks before they even happened. How do you mentally survive an enemy who knows all of your deepest insecurities? And what is the powerful psychological tool of future self-visualization that he used to prepare for the ultimate confrontation? Imagine staring into a large piece of polished bronze, trying to see not who you are today, but the exact person you must become tomorrow. For Demosthenes, preparing for a brutal legal war meant fighting the battle in his own mind, long before he ever stepped foot back into the courtroom. We left him on the windy shores of the Aegean Sea, hardening his lungs and his voice against the crashing waves. His physical instrument was finally repaired. But a strong voice without a focused mind is like a sharp sword swinging wildly in the dark. Historical records tell us that Demosthenes returned to his quiet underground study to master the mental game of public speaking. He used a psychological tool that modern neuroscientists and professional athletes rely on today: future self-visualization. Listen for this word: visualization. Visualization is the mental act of forming a highly detailed picture in your mind of something that has not yet happened. Try repeating this short phrase aloud. Practice daily visualization. Demosthenes did not just vaguely hope that his trial would go well. He hung a large mirror in his study. He stood in front of it for hours, watching his own facial expressions. He vividly imagined the specific day of the trial. He pictured the blinding sunlight of the Athenian agora. He heard the murmur of the massive jury, which, in Athens, could consist of hundreds of citizens. Most importantly, he imagined his corrupt guardians, Ephobus, Demophon, and Theripides, sitting across from him, glaring with absolute contempt. He knew these men intimately. He knew they would not just argue about financial records or missing property. They would attack his character, They would try to trigger his old anxieties. Listen to this word: anticipate. To anticipate means to carefully expect something to happen and deliberately prepare for it in advance. Try saying it softly to yourself. You must anticipate the attack. To survive, he had to anticipate their cruelty. He knew they would try to bring back the nervous, stuttering boy everyone remembered. They would try to mock him in front of the jury. Notice this important verb: provoke. To provoke means to deliberately say or do something to make another person angry or upset, forcing them to react badly. Try repeating this sentence: do not let them provoke you. His enemies desperately wanted to provoke him. Biologically, if a person feels provoked and angry, their heart rate spikes. The breath becomes shallow and erratic. For someone who previously suffered from a severe stutter and shortness of breath, anger would be completely disastrous. The moment he lost his temper, he would lose his voice. And if he lost his voice, he would lose his inheritance forever. By practicing future self-visualization in front of the mirror, Demosthenes was systematically training his nervous system. When you vividly imagine a highly stressful scenario, your brain's amygdala and motor cortex activate almost exactly as if the event is happening in reality. By visualizing the hostile courtroom over and over again, he was giving his biological stress response a dry run. He imagined the exact moment Aphobus would insult him, and he mentally rehearsed taking a slow, deep breath instead of reacting. He imagined remaining completely calm while the crowd muttered. When you practice the future in your mind, the society of the present cannot easily shock you. But mental control must translate to physical presence. During this intense mirror training, Demosthenes noticed a small, lingering problem. Whenever he spoke passionately or formed a complex argument, he had a nervous, involuntary habit. He would suddenly twitch one of his shoulders upward. In a modern conversation, a shoulder twitch is meaningless. But in ancient Athens, physical grace and control were deeply tied to a person's public authority. A nervous twitch signaled a weak mind. Demosthenes knew he had to eliminate it entirely. Listen to this word: posture. Posture is the specific way you hold your body, your back, and your shoulders when you are sitting or standing. Try saying this short phrase gently. Maintain a strong posture. To correct his posture, historical accounts claim he devised a brilliant, slightly terrifying method. He suspended a sharp sword from the ceiling of his underground room, adjusting the height so the tip of the blade hovered just millimeters above his troublesome shoulder. Then, he began to practice his hours-long speeches. If he lost his focus, if he let his nerves take over and his shoulder twitched upward, the sharp blade would immediately pierce his skin. It was an absolute physical boundary. The pain acted as a sudden, undeniable reminder to maintain his composure. Day after day, speaking under the hanging sword, his body learned to remain perfectly still, grounded, and dignified, no matter how intense his emotions became. He forced his external posture to reflect his new internal calm. This is how self-trust is finalized. You set tiny promises, like keeping your shoulder still, and you track your progress. You handle your physical failures without shame, using them only as data to adjust your stance. You create strict boundaries around your reactions, and you visualize the person you need to be until your nervous system believes it. We have now seen the complete preparation of a master. Demosthenes has built his physical voice on the beach. He has built his mental fortress in front of the mirror. He has anticipated the cruelty of his enemies, and he has corrected his nervous posture under the blade of a sword. He is no longer the frightened, wealthy boy who ran away crying. But practice, no matter how perfect, is still just practice. The ultimate test of his future self-visualization was finally approaching. He was 20 years old. The legal deadline had arrived. He marched up to the law courts, drafting formal lawsuits against his corrupt guardians to demand the return of his stolen inheritance. When the massive jury of Athenian citizens saw the boy they used to mock as the stutterer confidently step back onto the platform, how did they react? And what happened to his perfectly trained voice when the ancient water clock finally began to drip? Imagine the intense silence that falls over a massive crowd just before a known failure is expected to embarrass himself again. The citizens of Athens remembered the weak, trembling boy who ran away from the platform. They expected a disaster. But the young man standing before them now was completely unrecognizable. We are standing inside the Dikasterion, the ancient Athenian law court. It is around 364 BC. Before Demosthenes sits a massive jury. In major financial disputes, the jury could consist of 500 ordinary citizens, sitting tightly packed on wooden benches under the open sky. Across the courtyard sits his primary target, Aphobus, his former guardian. Aphobus is older, wealthy, and deeply confident. He expects an easy victory. He looks at Demosthenes and sees only the frightened child he had easily robbed for a decade. Next to the speaker's platform, an official fills the clepsydra, the ancient terracotta water clock. The water begins to drip steadily from the top vessel to the bottom. In a society without digital timers, this dripping water was the absolute boundary of a person's time to speak. When the water ran out, your chance for justice was over. The official signaled. It was time to speak up. Listen for this word, assert. To assert means to state a fact or belief confidently and forcefully, refusing to be ignored. Try saying this short phrase quietly to yourself. You must assert your rights. For years, Demosthenes had failed to assert himself. He had allowed fear and procrastination to keep his mouth shut. But as he looked at Aphobus, he did not feel the familiar paralyzing rush of shame. His biological system was calm. Because he had spent months practicing future self-visualization in front of his mirror, this highly stressful environment felt entirely familiar to his nervous system. The crowd was loud, but it was not as loud as the roaring ocean he had conquered on the beach. Demosthenes took a slow, deep breath, engaging the powerful lung capacity he had built running up the steep hills of Greece. He opened his mouth, and the words flowed perfectly. There was no stutter. There was no desperate gasping for air. There was no nervous shoulder twitch. His posture was perfect, anchored by the memory of the sharp sword hanging in his underground room. His voice boomed across the courtyard, clear, rich, and undeniably powerful. The jury of 500 men sat in stunned silence. This was not a boy begging for pity. This was a master of rhetoric commanding the space. He presented a brilliant, devastatingly logical case against his guardians. He used their own financial records against them, systematically proving exactly how they had drained his father's estate. Listen closely to this word, compensate. To compensate means to give someone money or something of value to make up for a loss, injury, or theft. Try saying it softly. They must compensate him for his loss. He demanded that his corrupt guardians fully compensate him for the decade of stolen wealth. For hours, he spoke flawlessly. He completely controlled the emotional wave of the courtroom, moving the jury from anger at the guardian's betrayal to deep respect for his own endurance. When Aphobos and the others tried to shout and provoke him, Demosthenes simply held his ground. He did not react with blind anger. He maintained his strict internal boundary, trusting the hundreds of tiny promises he had kept in the dark. By the time the last drop of water fell from the clepsydra, the outcome was undeniable. Notice this important word, verdict. A verdict is the final decision made by a jury or judge in a court of law. Try repeating this sentence. The jury delivered their verdict. The Athenian jury voted, and the verdict was a massive, humiliating defeat for his guardians. Demosthenes had won. The court legally ordered Aphobos to pay a staggering sum. Historians note the judgment was for 10 talents, an absolute fortune in the ancient world, representing decades of a normal worker's wages. The strategy had worked perfectly. His brutal physical training, his emotional regulation, and his mental endurance had completely transformed reality. He had taken his stolen honor back. But human society is deeply flawed. Justice on paper is very different from justice in reality. As the crowd dispersed and the shock of his brilliant performance settled, Demosthenes waited to collect his rightful property. But the money did not arrive. Aphobos was a cunning and wealthy man. Aphobos, a cunning and wealthy man, had anticipated that he might lose the public trial. So, while Demosthenes was busy practicing his speeches, Aphobos had quietly hidden his wealth. Evidence suggests he legally transferred his massive estate to other people, moved his cash, and claimed he was entirely bankrupt. When Demosthenes finally went to collect the money that the jury had legally awarded him, he found nothing but empty houses and closed doors. Aphobos simply refused to pay, completely ignoring the boundary set by the highest court in the city. This is a critical moment in the psychology of self-trust. Demosthenes had done everything perfectly. He had overcome his physical limitations. He had faced his worst fear. He had spoken up and won the highest possible validation from his society. And yet, the external world still cheated him. Many people would shatter at this exact moment. When you finally build the courage to set a boundary, and another person aggressively steps right over it without consequence, the natural biological response is total despair. The brain asks, why did I even try? Why did I do all that hard work if the result is exactly the same? So, how does a person handle a spectacular victory that suddenly turns into dust? Does Demosthenes retreat back into his underground room, defeated by a corrupt system? Or does he realize that the true prize he won that day was not the money at all? Winning a massive victory in a courtroom means absolutely nothing if your enemy secretly burns the prize. But what happens when you realize the prize you spent years fighting for was actually an illusion? Imagine Demosthenes standing in front of his former guardian's estate, holding a legally binding order from the highest court in Athens. He had defeated Aphobus in a brutal public trial. He had conquered his stutter. He had done everything right. But as he looked at the property, the doors were locked. The servants were gone. The accounts were completely empty. Aphobus had exploited legal loopholes. He had quietly transferred his enormous wealth to relatives and claimed he had nothing left to give. Listen for this word, conceal. To conceal means to carefully hide something or keep it a secret so that no one can find it. Try saying this short phrase quietly to yourself. He tried to conceal the truth. Aphobus had successfully concealed the money. Demosthenes did not immediately give up. He applied his intense discipline to the problem. He filed secondary lawsuits, demanding the right to seize Aphobus's remaining physical property. He fought aggressively for 3 more years. But historical evidence strongly suggests that, in the end, Demosthenes recovered only a tiny fraction of his original inheritance. The gold was gone. His father's grand manufacturing business was permanently lost. By all external measures, society would look at this and call it a tragic failure. The Athenian courts had failed to enforce the legal boundary they had just set. The corrupt men had essentially won. But here is where we see a profound shift in human psychology. When you tie your self-trust entirely to external results, like winning money, getting a promotion, or forcing other people to behave fairly, you will always remain biologically fragile. Your nervous system will constantly spike with stress because you simply cannot control the outside world. Notice this powerful word, intrinsic. Intrinsic means something that is naturally part of a person, coming entirely from the inside rather than the outside. Try repeating this sentence. You must build intrinsic value. Now listen to its opposite, extrinsic. Extrinsic means a reward, result, or motivation that comes from the outside world, like money or public praise. Try saying it softly. Do not rely on extrinsic rewards. For 10 years, Demosthenes believed his goal was an extrinsic reward, recovering his father's stolen money. But the brutal process of preparing for that trial had fundamentally changed his biology. Aphobus could conceal the gold, but he could not steal the courage Demosthenes had built in the dark. No one could take away his expanded lungs, his perfectly articulated voice, or his calm, regulated nervous system. The underground room, the crashing waves, and the hanging sword had given Demosthenes the ultimate intrinsic reward: absolute self-trust. He realized he no longer needed his father's old money to survive. He possessed a physical and mental skill that could generate 1,000 times that wealth. In the democracy of ancient Athens, a master of public speaking could write his own destiny. Demosthenes shifted his focus. He stopped chasing the ghost of his stolen inheritance. Instead, he began to rent out his new superpower to other people. He became a professional speechwriter, known in ancient Greek as a logographer. Listen to this word, persuasion. Persuasion is the act of successfully convincing someone to do or believe something through reasoning or argument. Try saying it gently. Master the art of persuasion. In a city where everyone had to argue their own legal cases, the art of persuasion was the most valuable commodity in existence. Wealthy citizens involved in massive financial disputes, political scandals, and trade disagreements began to hire him. They paid him huge sums of silver to write their speeches and teach them how to perform in front of the jury. He taught them how to stand, how to breathe, and how to handle the ruthless crowds. He was no longer the weak, stuttering boy mocked by the city. He was the wealthy, highly respected master pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had built a comfortable, highly successful life. His reputation as a brilliant legal mind spread across the entire region. He was safe. But a comfortable life is rarely the end of a true historical epic. We have now closed the loop on his childhood trauma. Demosthenes has accepted the loss of his inheritance, transformed his pain into a highly paid profession, and secured his place at the top of Athenian society. He has won his personal war. However, while Demosthenes was safely making a fortune in the local courts, a much larger, far more terrifying threat was growing in the north. A brilliant, one-eyed king was quietly building an unstoppable military machine, preparing to swallow the entire Greek world. When the survival of the democratic society itself is suddenly threatened, will the comfortable professional speechwriter risk his safe new life to step back into the line of fire? And who is this terrifying northern king whose shadow is about to fall over Athens? Imagine watching a deadly storm gathering on the horizon, but every single person around you refuses to look up. They are laughing, doing business, and ignoring the black sky, while you are the only one who sees the coming lightning. This was the exact position Demosthenes found himself in a few years after securing his comfortable life as a speechwriter. In the north, a brilliant and utterly ruthless man named King Philip II of Macedon was systematically conquering the independent Greek city-states. Philip was a military genius. He had survived brutal assassinations, lost an eye in battle, and transformed a disorganized kingdom into an unstoppable, professional war machine. One by one, he was swallowing the northern territories, creeping closer and closer to the borders of Athens. But down in the warm, democratic city of Athens, the citizens did not want to hear about war. They were exhausted from previous conflicts. Listen for this word, complacent. To be complacent means to be so comfortable with your current situation that you completely ignore dangerous changes happening around you. Try repeating this short sentence. Do not become complacent. The Athenian politicians had become deeply complacent. King Philip was highly intelligent. He used psychology, not just swords, to conquer. He sent massive bribes of gold to Athenian leaders. He signed false peace treaties. He spoke politely to their ambassadors. He used every political trick available to keep the Athenians asleep while he slowly surrounded them. To appease means to pacify an aggressive enemy by giving them exactly what they want, falsely hoping they will stop. Try saying this gentle phrase. You cannot appease a tyrant. The leaders of Athens desperately wanted to appease Philip. They created a culture of collective denial. When a threat is too massive and terrifying for a nervous system to process, the brain often defaults to a freeze response. It actively suppresses the fear and pretends everything is normal. Entire nations can experience this psychological freeze. The Athenian assembly convinced itself that Philip was just a temporary nuisance. But a quiet life, built on a lie, is a fragile life. Demosthenes recognized this societal freeze response immediately. He had lived it. As a young boy, he had watched his corrupt guardians steal his inheritance, and he had frozen in denial for 10 years. He knew the heavy, toxic cost of staying silent. To keep the peace. He knew that ignoring a predator never makes the predator go away. This brings us to the ultimate test of self-trust: speaking up. It is relatively easy to speak up when everyone agrees. It requires an entirely different level of internal strength to speak up when society aggressively demands silence. Listen to this word: unpopular. If something is unpopular, it is disliked or rejected by the majority of people. Try saying it softly. He had an unpopular opinion. Demosthenes knew that warning Athens about Philip would be deeply unpopular. He was a wealthy, safe professional. He could have easily kept his mouth shut, collected his silver, and hidden behind his comfortable walls. True self-trust forces a person to act in alignment with reality. He took the psychological tool he had mastered, future self-visualization, and applied it to his entire city. He looked at the map, and he visualized the inevitable future. He clearly saw the Macedonian army burning ships. He imagined the total destruction of the ancient democracy. The terrible clarity of that vision triggered his courage. He refused to let his city suffer the same silent robbery he had suffered as a child. He realized the boundary drawn around his own dignity now had to be drawn around his homeland. So, Demosthenes made a radical pivot. He stopped writing legal speeches for wealthy merchants. He took his perfectly trained, booming voice and stepped back onto the bema, the public platform of the assembly. He abandoned the safety of private courts to step into the dangerous arena of international politics. He was going to use his immense discipline to wake up an empire. He began to deliver a series of highly aggressive, brilliant political speeches entirely focused on the Macedonian threat. These speeches were so sharp, unrelenting, and so famous that we still use a specific word for them in modern English today: a philippic. A philippic is a bitter, passionate speech that fiercely attacks a political enemy. We have reached a massive turning point. The bullied boy has become the sole voice of warning for the greatest city in the ancient world. He is speaking up loudly and clearly against an unstoppable king. How does a sleeping society react when someone violently shakes them awake? Do Athenians finally listen to the genius of his logic? Or do they turn their collective anger against the man who is trying to save them? And what happens when King Philip II finally drops his polite disguise and marches his massive army south? Imagine trying to wake up a person who is deeply asleep. Imagine trying to wake up a person who is only pretending to be asleep. They do not just ignore you, they get actively angry. When Demosthenes stood on the speaker's platform and delivered his furious philippics, the citizens of Athens did not immediately cheer. In fact, his brilliant speeches were met with deep, aggressive resistance. The people did not want to hear that King Philip II of Macedon was a tyrant who planned to destroy their ancient democracy. They wanted to enjoy religious festivals, trade olive oil, and listen to comfortable politicians who promised endless peace. Listen to this word: hostile. Hostile means showing strong unfriendliness or aggressive opposition to something. Try saying this short phrase quietly to yourself. The crowd was hostile. The Athenian assembly grew hostile. Rival politicians, particularly a famous and highly skilled orator named Aeschines, violently attacked Demosthenes. Historical records show that Aeschines was likely receiving massive bribes from Macedon to keep Athens passive. Aeschines mocked Demosthenes. He called him a warmonger. He tried to ruin his reputation using the same tactics of public humiliation that Demosthenes' corrupt guardians had used. This time, the biology of the man on the platform was completely different. Demosthenes did not freeze. He did not lose his breath or run away to hide his face in his heavy cloak. Notice this essential word, delusion. A delusion is a false belief you stubbornly hold on to, even when physical evidence proves it is entirely wrong. Try saying it softly. Do not live in a delusion. Athens was living in a collective delusion. When a society is trapped in a delusion, telling the truth sounds like an act of war. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. When people are presented with cold facts that threaten their comfortable reality, their brains experience actual physical stress. To relieve that biological stress, they do not change their minds. They simply attack the person delivering the facts. Because Demosthenes had spent years building intrinsic self-trust, he no longer needed the crowd's approval to feel safe. His nervous system was anchored to reality, not popularity. He knew that setting a boundary around the truth meant he would be temporarily hated by people profiting from lies. So he persisted. To persist means to continue doing something firmly and solidly, even when difficult. Even when other people constantly oppose you. Try repeating this sentence. You must persist through the difficulty. For more than a decade, Demosthenes persisted. He delivered speech after speech, refusing to back down. He traveled dangerously to other Greek city-states. He used his mastery of persuasion to do the impossible. He convinced Thebes, a bitter enemy of Athens, to join forces and build a desperate military alliance against Macedon. He poured his own massive wealth, the silver he had earned as a professional speechwriter, into funding the Athenian navy. He matched his brilliant words with undeniable physical action. Notice this core word, integrity. Integrity is the rare quality of being completely honest and having strong moral principles that you absolutely refuse to compromise. Try saying this short phrase gently. Act with strict integrity. His integrity finally began to crack the societal delusion. As King Philip's army marched closer, capturing cities and breaking every peace treaty he had signed, the Athenians woke up. They realized Demosthenes had been right. Comfortable politicians had lied to them. The storm was no longer just a shadow on the distant horizon. It was standing at their gates. In 338 BC, King Philip finally dropped his polite disguise entirely. He marched his highly trained professional army, including his brilliant teenage son, Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great, directly into central Greece. The Athenians were utterly terrified. But because of Demosthenes, they were no longer frozen in denial. They mobilized their forces. They marched out to meet the Macedonian war machine at a small, dusty town called Chaeronea. Demosthenes himself, now a wealthy man in his late 40s, did not hide behind his money. He put on a heavy bronze breastplate, picked up a massive wooden shield, and stood in the front lines as an ordinary foot soldier. He did not just speak about courage from a safe distance. He physically stood in the mud to defend his home. We have reached the ultimate climax of his external life. The sickly boy who once could not even speak to a crowd is now standing shoulder to shoulder with his fellow citizens, waiting for the brutal impact of the greatest military force in the ancient world. He has spoken up. He has told the truth. He has trusted himself completely. But the universe does not always reward integrity with a fairy tale ending. What happens when you do everything perfectly, build unshakable self-trust, and face your greatest fear? But the external enemy is simply too strong. How does a person survive the total collapse of their physical world without losing their mind? Imagine standing in a dry, dusty field, watching a solid wall of 18-foot wooden spears march directly toward you. The ground is shaking. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, bronze, and absolute terror. It is August 338 BC. We are at the Battle of Chaeronea,